Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English, and we now are going to pick up a very interesting story. In fact, you will argue probably at the end of our study, this is one of the more unusual stories that you've ever read. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, the author Ambrose, Bierce. I'm with you in your hymnal on page 478, 479. Now, the place that I'm actually going to begin with this story will be on page 478 with literary analysis. Let's go ahead and make a couple of quick observations about what this story is going to teach us. One of the things that this story is going to teach us is how authors vary their storytelling. Now let's go ahead and talk about point of view real quickly. So I would write that down at 2B. Point of view. All right. Again, this is going to be our rhetorical point of emphasis in this story. Point of view. Let's define it first of all. Point of view is, as your book tells you, the perspective or the vantage point from which the story is told. Okay? There's basically two, at least, ways to tell a story. Okay? That's very popular. There is a third, but it's not as popular. The first perspective is what we call first person point of view, or POV. First person point of view, the narrator is actually in the story. So I would write that down that way. The person telling the story is actually in the story. Narrator, part of the story. First person. The way you're going to know this is the narrator will use the word I did this, I did that, I did this. Okay? The second way that stories often get told is from third person point of view. A third person, again, you're writing this down at 2B. You're writing this down. Okay, third person point of view. Third person point of view is when some kind of narrator on the outside will tell the story. This narrator is not a part of the actual story. Okay? Now there's two different kinds of third person point of view. The first is what we will call limited. The second is what we will call omniscient. Now let's define both of them. A limited perspective in third person POV is that certain of the character's thoughts the narrator will let you know about. Let you know what the character is thinking. Okay? But not all of the characters. That's why we call it limited. An omniscient third person point of view is going to be a perspective from which all of the different ways of thinking about the story and in the story, all of those ways of thinking are in fact told to the reader. So the narrator ostensibly has the ability to be able to say, I can tell you what all of the different characters are thinking. So you have an ability to know what all of them are thinking. All right? The other term, and we have to talk about it before we get now to our text on 478. The other term written there is stream of consciousness. Do you see it? I hope you've written it down at 2B. Stream of consciousness. Now, exactly what are we talking about there? Well, this is a certain kind of storytelling approach that will be called stream of consciousness later. Okay? Now, what is that all about? Well, we call it stream of consciousness in large measure because of the great Viennese psychologist Sigmund Freud, F-R-E-U-D, Freud. Freud made an observation about the human mind. He said that if we were to step right now into your mind and we could read your thoughts the way you read words at the bottom of an ESPN screen. Are you familiar with this? If you've ever watched ESPN, at the very bottom, they'll run words where you get to read those words. Might be scores, might be important news events or whatever. You've probably seen this on other channels as well, right? Where that ticker tape is running along the bottom. Freud said, right now, if we were to step inside of your mind and we could read your thoughts, he said two things about that strand of words that are thoughts. Two things. One, he said that there isn't one strand happening right now, but multiple strands happening at the same time. You're thinking multiple thoughts right now on different levels. Now, the fact that you might say, dude, I am not doing that right now at all, leads us to the second point that he made about the mind. And that is Almost all of our thoughts we are unaware of. And we're also unaware of their motivations. What makes us think the thoughts we think? He said way over 90% of that stuff we are unaware of until we study our dreams. Our dreams. So in 1900, when he publishes his famous book called Interpretation of Dreams, there's a reason why he spends so much time thinking and talking about dreams. He says that when we dream, a lot of that unconscious material comes to the surface and we play with it. We think about it. Now, out of this idea, and by the way, those strands of thought, Freud said, that are working all the time, those strands of thinking are usually going to be centered around several major places. One, he said, was sex. Everybody thinking about sex all the time. You can imagine in 1900 that was a major controversial position that he took. By the way, the reason for sex, though, borrows from Darwin and the desire for the species to promulgate itself and to somehow survive. That's why sex is such a big deal. Then he said the other one is aggression. We would like to take a bat and go bash somebody over the head with it, but we've been acculturated to not do that. And so we do what he calls sublimate a lot of our bad thinking, our negative thinking, into our mind, which is why we act out in strange ways. For example, the number of you right now who have something in your mouth that you're chewing on. Freud said this right here, this thing we do, it is evidence that in fact we have all kinds of inner, certain kinds of feelings. The third one, he said, is fear. We're constantly afraid. We're worrying all the time. Again, which is why we often will bite on our nails or whatever. Now, how does all of this translate into short story and novel telling? Good question. I'm glad you asked it. We're now working at 2B. A number of artists, especially in written form, ask this simple question. What if you told a story from the perspective of a person's mind and their thoughts? And all you did was run their thoughts, word for word, what they're thinking. Their thoughts would be kind of like a river or a stream, where all of these words would just be coming out. Stream of consciousness is the attempt. I'd write this down as the definition. It will make sense once you start reading the story. Stream of consciousness is the attempt to represent human thought in its successive thinking patterns. Just word for word for word. Okay? Now at 3A, let's just say this real quickly. At 3A, we have several titles that immediately come to mind that are classic texts of stream of consciousness. The most famous is probably the most famous novel of the 20th century, James Joyce's 1922 offering called Ulysses. For 800 plus pages, we have the thinking of just almost one person in one day. See, because here's what's said today. If all the thoughts that you've been thinking since I started talking about this in the last 5 minutes, if all of those thoughts were printed on paper, every thought that you and you alone were thinking were printed on paper. In other words, we just hit the print key and let all those thoughts just be printed, the room that you're sitting in would be completely filled with paper. Some of you will say, I've been totally daydreaming and didn't hear a word you said. Proves Freud's point even more to the point. So you weren't thinking at all. Well, I don't know. Maybe I was. I was just sitting there daydreaming while you were droning on about some Viennese cat named Freud. So what was your mind doing while you were doing that? I don't know. I imagine it was probably thinking. Thinking what? And on multiple strands, what? Okay? For Freud then, and for many to follow, this idea of telling a story from the inner dimensions of the human psyche becomes a major project. We also think of a great American writer, I'm back at 3A, named William Faulkner, Faulkner, who will write several important novels. We think, of course, of the first 100 pages of the Benji section in Sound and Fury. Nothing more than stream of consciousness. Sometimes very difficult to read. In, for example, Ulysses, you have a famous chapter where there are no periods. But that would make sense. If we were to represent your thinking right now, we wouldn't use punctuation. You don't think in punctuation. So, for example, you say, I wish I was somewhere else. Stop. Capital letter. I would like to be going to the mall right now. Stop. Capital letter. No. When you think, you just think words, correct? And sometimes those words don't necessarily all go together. You're thinking one thought, then you're thinking another thought, then you're thinking a third thought. If you were representing that in writing, you would just put that one right after the other. Sometimes that's very hard to read. It's a challenge. Virginia Woolf is a third writer that you can write down in 3A, who also in her classic To the Lighthouse plays around this game of stream of consciousness writing. We now turn to Ambrose Bierce and his classic story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. We find this reading in a section of readings that are going to treat the American Civil War experience. Ambrose Bierce will set his story during the time of the American Civil War. All we're going to focus on in our first reading of this story, though, is plot at level 1. So I'd write this down. Plot. All we're going to do is simply tell the events of the story. First this happens, then this happens, then this happens, as we work to get to the end of the story. This is a story about an execution. I'd write that down at level 1. This is a story about an execution. This is a story about an escape. I would write that down. This is a story about an execution. A soldier is going to be killed, executed. This is a story about an escape. A soldier is going to get away. I'm with you now on page 481 at background information. Notice, read with me, the senseless violence, death, and destruction Ambrose Bierce witnessed during the American Civil War convinced him that war was terrible and futile. He set much of his best fiction, including this story, against the backdrop of this divisive war in which the agricultural South, whose economy was based on slavery, battled the more industrialized North. Fought mostly in the South, the war caused hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. Now I'd like to point out really quickly, do you see it on 481, the Roman numeral number 1? Then do you see on 483 the Roman numeral number 2? And then on 484 the Roman numeral number 3? Do you see that? And then we have the story ending on 489. Do you see that? So what you want to do right now is you want to write down Roman numeral 1, skip 5 lines. Roman numeral 2, skip 5 lines. Roman numeral 3, skip 5 lines. And in between then, each one of those, all we're going to do at level 1 is summarize the story. Now, at the end of the story, you're going to understand why. I would write this down right now at 2B. This is one of the greatest gotcha stories of all time. I'm not going to explain what gotcha means, but by the end of the story, you'll know what I mean when I say gotcha stories. All right? Okay, here we go. We're on 481. We are beginning now. We're going to listen to our professional reader read us the story. Again, let me challenge you to follow the words of the story. Don't just listen to the storyteller read you the story. Literally try to follow the words yourself and improve yourself as a reader and not just as a listener. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. Here we go.
An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge by Ambrose Bierce. A man stood upon a railroad bridge in northern Alabama, looking down into the swift water 20 feet below. The man's hands were behind his back, the wrists bound with a cord. A rope closely encircled his neck. It was attached to a stout cross timber above his head, and the slack fell to the level of his knees. Some loose boards laid upon the sleepers supporting the metals of the railway supplied a footing for him and his executioners, 2 private soldiers of the Federal Army, directed by a sergeant who in civil life may have been a deputy sheriff. At a short remove upon the same temporary platform was an officer in the uniform of his rank, armed. He was a captain. A sentinel at each end of the bridge stood with his rifle in the position known as support, that is to say, vertical in front of the left shoulder, the hammer resting on the forearm thrown straight across the chest, a formal and unnatural position, enforcing an erect carriage of the body. It did not appear to be the duty of these 2 men to know what was occurring at the center of the bridge. They merely blockaded the 2 ends of the foot planking that traversed it. Beyond one of the sentinels, Nobody was in sight. The railroad ran straight away into a forest for 100 yards, then, curving, was lost to view. Doubtless there was an outpost farther along. The other bank of the stream was open ground, a gentle acclivity, topped with a stockade of vertical tree trunks, loopholed for rifles, with a single embrasure through which protruded the muzzle of a brass cannon commanding the bridge. Midway of the slope between bridge and fort were the spectators, a single company of infantry in line at parade rest, the butts of the rifles on the ground, the barrels inclining slightly backward against the right shoulder, the hands crossed upon the stock. A lieutenant stood at the right of the line, the point of his sword upon the ground, his left hand resting upon his right. Excepting the group of four at the center of the bridge, not a man moved. The company faced the bridge, staring stonily, motionless. The sentinels facing the banks of the stream might have been statues to adorn the bridge. The captain stood with folded arms, silent, observing the work of his subordinates, but making no sign.
Now let's just point out for a brief moment at level 2B that the story opens with omniscient third-person point of view. Whoever is telling this story is almost like he or she is in a helicopter right above the events that are taking place and just describing them. Do you got me? That's what we mean by omniscient third-person point of view. Just describing everything that you would be seeing. If you were watching this in a movie, you would be seeing a guy standing at the center of a bridge, a rope around his neck. He is about to be hanged. You have soldiers standing around. One or two of them will do the execution. The rest of them are there for protection. We are in the middle of what time period? The American Civil War. Here we go.
Death is a dignitary who, when he comes announced, is to be received with formal manifestations of respect, even by those most familiar with him. In the code of military etiquette, silence and fixity are forms of deference. The man who was engaged in being hanged was apparently about 35 years of age. He was a civilian, if one might judge from his habit, which was that of a planter. His features were good, a straight nose, firm mouth, broad forehead from which his long dark hair was combed straight back, falling behind his ears to the collar of his well-fitting frock coat. He wore a mustache and pointed beard, but no whiskers. His eyes were large and dark gray, and had a kindly expression which one would hardly have expected in one whose neck was in the hem. Evidently, this was no vulgar assassin. The liberal military code makes provision for hanging many kinds of persons, and gentlemen are not excluded. The preparations being complete, the two private soldiers stepped aside, and each drew away the plank upon which he had been standing. The sergeant turned to the captain, saluted, and placed himself immediately behind that officer, who in turn moved apart one pace. These movements left the condemned man and the sergeant standing on the two ends of the same plank, which spanned three of the cross ties of the bridge. The end upon which the civilian stood almost, but not quite, reached a fourth. This plank had been held in place by the weight of the captain. It was now held by that of the sergeant. At a signal from the former, the latter would step aside, the plank would tilt, and the condemned man go down between two ties. The arrangement commended itself to his judgment as simple and effective. His face had not been covered, nor his eyes bandaged. He looked a moment at his unsteadfast footing, then let his gaze wander to the swirling water of the stream racing madly beneath his feet. A piece of dancing driftwood caught his attention, and his eyes followed it down the current. How slowly it appeared to move. What a sluggish stream. He closed his eyes in order to fix his last thoughts upon his wife and children. The water, touched to gold by the early sun, the brooding mists under the banks at some distance down the stream, the fort, the soldiers, the piece of drift, all had distracted him. But now he became conscious of a new disturbance. Striking through the thought of his dear ones was a sound which he could neither ignore nor understand. a sharp, distinct, metallic percussion, like the stroke of a blacksmith's hammer upon the anvil. It had the same ringing quality. He wondered what it was, and whether immeasurably distant or nearby, it seemed both. Its recurrence was regular, but as slow as the tolling of a death knell. He awaited each stroke with impatience, and, he knew not why, apprehension. The intervals of silence grew progressively longer. The delays became maddening. With their greater infrequency, the sounds increased in strength and sharpness. They hurt his ear like the thrust of a knife. He feared he would shriek. What he heard was the ticking of his watch. He unclosed his eyes and saw again the water below him. If I could free my hands, he thought, I might throw off the noose and spring into the stream. By diving, I could evade the bullets and, swimming vigorously, reach the bank, take to the woods, and get away home. My home, thank God, is as yet outside their lines. My wife and little ones are still beyond the invaders' farthest advance. As these thoughts, which have here to be set down in words, were flashed into the doomed man's brain rather than evolved from it, the captain nodded to the sergeant. The sergeant stepped aside.
Okay, let's make a couple of quick observations. I'm actually going to begin, interestingly, maybe for one or two of you, at level 3A, other texts. Do you remember in our study of Poe's Fall of the House of Usher that we made the observation during that story that Usher, it swears that he can hear his sister, right? And her sister's voice, if you'll remember that story. Notice here we have a very similar kind of circumstance. Right before he is to be executed,